Recently, Jesuit priest James Martin claimed that because certain church teachings have not been received by those that the teachings were originally intended for, therefore, those teachings should be changed or at least modified to some degree. And here's what James Martin had to say.
Briefly put, I mean, and I'm no theologian, but, for a teaching to be really authoritative, it is expected that it will be received by the people of God, by the faithful. So you look at something like, say, the Assumption. So the Assumption is declared, and people accept that. They go to the Feast of the Assumption, they believe in the Assumption, it's received. From what I can tell, in the LGBT community, the teaching that LGBT people must be celibate their entire lives, not just, before marriage, as it is for most people, but their entire lives, has not been received. Now, I say this and people go crazy, and this is simply based on LGBT people that I speak to. Now, there are some that believe that. I would say it's a very small percentage of people, right? But that's a simple fact. You can say that they don't agree with it. I would say the teaching, therefore, has not been received by the community to which it was largely directed.
It's like whenever I read some of these conservative Catholic pundits who are sort of very, very staunchly opposed to all things homosexual, they sort of write as if they're unaware that a lot of Catholics actually support me and Andy getting married.
Right.
And it's really interesting because, and this is something that, people like Catholic ethicists point out a lot in their books, at some point, theological teaching does have to come into contact with the shape of things on the ground. And in the U.S., the shape of things on the ground is such that a lot of Catholics do support gay marriage.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's two refinements of that, though. One is that in other parts of the world it's not, and so for the church to change on that would mean that, in sub-Saharan Africa, you really probably would be run out of the church. I mean, run out of the physical church. You'd probably be. I lived in Kenya for 2 years. You'd probably be ejected, or certainly made you feel like you weren't welcome. People would be somewhat vocal. And the second thing is that for some people, what the theologians say is different than what the church leaders would say, as we know. So there's a disconnect between that legitimate reflection, which is that theology should take into account the experience of people of God, right? And that the Holy Spirit is working in them. But on some of these questions, I think that church leaders resist that. They resist that very notion, which is in fact sort of the reception of teaching, right? And there's resistance to that because a lot of it's from the top down. I mean, you take something without getting into a big discussion. I mean, look at Humanae Vitae. Humanae Vitae is still in effect, and as far as I can tell, the large majority of Western Catholics have made their peace with that, and yet that church teaching has not changed. And that's a much older church teaching. I mean, in a sense, that's Humanae Vitae is 1968, and a lot of stuff we're talking about is very new. I mean, people to reflect on LGBT stuff. So the question is, again, there's a disconnect between the theological world, and as there sadly is, and church leadership, the episcopacy.
When I first returned to the Catholic Church in 1999, I also did not receive many of the church teachings with regards to homosexuality. First of all, I did believe that, as James Martin has claimed, God made me this way. James Martin said that we are made gay by God. And I wholeheartedly believe that as well. If we accept that teaching and at the same time believe that we're born gay, God suddenly becomes sadistic. He created us with this desire that we could never act upon. Another Jesuit, John J. McNeill, described the paradox that exists. Since most gay people experience their homosexual orientation as a part of creation, If they accept this church teaching, they must see God as sadistically creating them with an intrinsic orientation to evil. Most gays would prefer to see the church teaching as wrong rather than believe God is sadistic. Because James Martin promulgates the born gay theory, he is actually causing the LGBT community not to receive the teachings of the church. In order to believe in a loving God, the LGBT community must reject the cruel and sadistic God of the Catechism that created certain men and women gay, but at the same time forbade them from acting upon those desires. Martin said, saying that one of the deepest parts of a person, the part that gives and receives love, is disordered, in itself is needlessly cruel. But what is actually needlessly cruel is to promote this false theology that anyone was born gay, let alone that God created someone gay. Martin has also set up a sort of counter Christ or gay affirmative Jesus, who, according to him, said nothing specifically about homosexuality, therefore he tacitly approved of it. As a result, we're left with two contrasting images of Jesus. One from James Martin. This Christ is gay affirmative and demands very little from the LGBT person, and a sadistic, cruel Jesus who is largely the creation of a homophobic and disconnected church hierarchy. With the help of truly compassionate men, I did finally understand that God is not sadistic or cruel, but merciful, and that the church is not homophobic, but wants what's best for all of us, including the LGBT community, and primarily desires for us to know the truth. What was probably the most important step in this realization was letting go of the idea that I had been born gay or that God made me gay. And that was only possible because I learned the truth, not only about what God wanted for me, but the truth of who I actually am. Thank God I had a spiritual director who actually challenged me. While it was somewhat easier to accept the church's teachings on chastity, just because my body had been so devastated by the reality of gay male sex, moving beyond a belief that God had made me gay was much more difficult because my identity had been wrapped up in all of that. It was most difficult to give up the belief in being born gay, because then that necessitated the question, why was I gay? And in that, I had to ask some very difficult questions about myself, my past, and my childhood. And that's where most gay men and women don't want to go. Therefore, it's going to take priests, religious, and Catholic men and women with a lot of courage to help those with same-sex attraction to receive the truth, even though that truth is very difficult to hear. God bless you all.